The smell of roasting peppers filled the kitchen like a warm memory coming back to life, and Chef Lieutenant Kale Mbangu moved between his stations with the easy grace of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. He was preparing a feast tonight, a proper one, the kind his grandmother used to make back on Earth, when the whole family would gather under the old tin roof and eat until nobody could move. And he had spent 3 days getting everything ready for this interspecies cultural exchange dinner aboard the colony station Hearthstone on the shared world of Valeth 9. The peri-peri sauce was bubbling in its pot, dark red and dangerous and perfect, and the smell alone was enough to make his sous chef, Rena Vasquez, close her eyes and whisper that it smelled like home. Valeth 9 was not home, though, not really. It was a colony world governed by the Galactic Concord, a massive coalition of 312 alien species that had grudgingly allowed humanity a seat at their table about 60 years ago, and humans had been given a modest patch of this planet to share with 7 other species under Concord rules. Kale did not care much about politics. He cared about food. And tonight, he was going to show every alien delegate in that dining hall what a real meal tasted like, because most of them had never experienced anything like it. The thing about aliens was that almost none of them cooked, not the way humans did. The Sulani ate raw biocultures that looked like wet moss. The Gazur absorbed mineral solutions through their crystalline skin. The Torvan tore into raw meat with their massive jaws and called it a meal. And the Ilvari consumed flavored light pulses that they described as music for the tongue. Nobody out here used fire to transform food. Nobody caramelized sugars, or roasted garlic, or braised meat until it fell apart at the touch of a fork. That was a human thing, and Kale believed with every bone in his body that it was the best thing humanity had ever invented. He was pulling a tray of roasted vegetables from the oven when the doors exploded inward. Not literally exploded, but they slammed open with such force that every pan rattled on its hook, and Rena dropped a bowl of marinade that shattered across the floor like a small red crime scene. 6 Concord enforcers marched in, tall figures in dark armor, with faceplates that reflected the kitchen flames back at Kale like accusations. And behind them walked a creature that made the room feel smaller just by entering it. High Arbiter Thesic of the Vren species stood nearly 3 meters tall, an insectoid figure with a segmented body covered in dark green chitin, and 4 arms folded behind his back like a judge approaching the condemned. His compound eyes swept across the kitchen and lingered on every flame with what Kale could only describe as disgust. "Extinguish all combustion sources immediately," Thesic said, and his voice came out flat and translated through a device on his throat, carrying no emotion at all, which somehow made it worse. The enforcers moved before Kale could respond. They turned off burners and sealed vents, and smothered the grill with chemical suppressant foam that killed the coals in seconds and left behind a smell like wet chalk that made Kale want to scream. "What is this?" Kale said, and his voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "What are you doing to my kitchen?" Thesic produced a thin, translucent tablet and held it up so the text glowed in the suddenly dark room. "Edict 4491-C, the Arbiter read. "Effective immediately, all combustion-based processes are prohibited on Valeth 9 and all shared Concord territories. Fire is hereby classified as a Class 3 atmospheric contaminant process and an uncontrolled exothermic hazard. Any species found in violation will face sanctions up to and including territorial expulsion." Kitchen was silent, except for the hiss of dying embers under chemical foam. Rena stepped forward, with fury in her eyes, but Kale caught her arm and held her back, because he had seen what happened to species that fought Concord enforcers, and it never ended with the species winning. "Who pushed for this?" Kale asked quietly. Thesic did not answer directly, but Kale already knew. Everyone knew. The Sulani had been complaining about atmospheric particulates for years. Their amphibious biology made them extremely sensitive to smoke, and even the faintest trace of combustion byproduct could trigger a reaction in their skin. And the Gezur considered open flame a spiritual violation, something akin to witnessing torture, because their crystalline bodies resonated with heat frequencies in ways that caused them genuine distress. These two species had been lobbying the Concord for decades, and tonight they had finally won. "You cannot do this," Rena said from behind. "Kale, cooking is not a weapon. It is not pollution. It is who we are." Thesic looked at her with those massive compound eyes, and Kale thought he saw something flicker there. Maybe pity. Maybe just the reflection of the last dying ember on the grill. "The edict does not target humanity specifically," Thesic said. "It applies to all species equally." "No other species uses fire for cooking," Kale said, and the words tasted bitter in his mouth. "You know that. This targets us, and only us." Thesic paused and then said, "Compliance is not optional. You have 48 hours to dismantle all combustion equipment. Failure to comply will result in the human delegation's removal from Violet 9. He turned and walked out, and the enforcers followed, and the kitchen doors swung shut behind them with a sound that felt like a coffin closing. Kale stood in his dead kitchen and looked at the chemical foam covering his grill, and the sealed burners, and the cold ovens that already had Concord lock plates welded over their doors, and he felt something crack inside his chest that was not his heart, but was close to it. His team gathered around him in the dark, 12 humans who had followed him across the stars, because they believed that feeding people was the most important thing a person could do, and now they stood in a kitchen that had been turned into a tomb. Rena picked up a spatula from the counter and held it like she was thinking about using it as a weapon. And honestly, Kale understood the impulse. "So what do we do now?" asked young Marco Chen, the newest member of the team, barely 20 years old, and already one of the best bread bakers Kale had ever trained. Kale reached into his pocket and pulled out an old silver lighter that had belonged to his grandmother, the same woman who had taught him that food was love made visible, and he turned it over in his fingers and felt its weight and thought about 1,000,000 years of human history that had started when some ancient ancestor had put meat near heat and changed everything. He set the lighter down on the cold steel counter and stared at it. Rena moved to stand beside him, and she looked at the lighter too, and then she looked at Kale and said something that changed everything. "They did not ban heat, Kale. They banned fire, and there is a difference." Kale looked at her, and in the darkness of that dead kitchen, something sparked behind his eyes that was not flame, but was just as dangerous. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, there is." 3 days after the kitchen died, Kale gathered his people in an empty cargo bay on the lower level of Hearthstone Station, and told them they were going to cook again. Nobody laughed, because nobody thought he was joking. They just looked at him with tired, hungry eyes, and waited for him to explain how. "We are going to build a new kitchen," Kale said, standing in front of a makeshift board covered in sketches and diagrams that Rena had drawn at 3 in the morning, while everyone else slept. "And we are not going to break a single line of Edict 4491C. The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. They were going to cook without fire, not by giving up heat, but by finding every other way in the universe to generate it. Kale had put out a call to every human on Valeth 9 who had useful skills, and the response had shocked him. Engineers and geologists and physicists and solar technicians had come forward within hours, people who missed the taste of cooked food so badly that they were willing to spend their off hours building impossible things. The first person to answer was Dr. Tomas Herrera, a geologist with wild gray hair and the kind of smile that made you think he was either a genius or completely out of his mind. Tomas had been mapping the subsurface of Valith 9 for years, and he knew something that made his eyes light up when Kale explained the problem. "There are thermal vents everywhere under this continent," Tomas said, pulling up a holographic map that glowed with red and orange veins of heat running beneath the surface like the planet itself had a circulatory system. "Natural geothermal energy, no combustion involved, just the planet being hot, because planets are hot. The Concord cannot ban geology, Kale." They started with the vents. Tomas led a team into the rocky highlands south of the colony, and they found a network of steam fissures that pushed superheated vapor through cracks in the basalt at temperatures exceeding 200 degrees. They built sealed stone pits around the vents, essentially high-tech versions of ancient Icelandic hot spring ovens. And they buried their first batch of bread dough wrapped in heat-resistant cloth, and waited. 6 hours later they pulled the bread out of the ground, and it was golden and crusty and steaming, and it smelled like the earth itself had decided to feed them. Kale broke the first loaf open, and the sound it made was so perfect that Marco Chen, who had been standing nearby, actually sat down on a rock and cried. Not dramatic tears, just the quiet kind that come when something you thought was gone forever comes back. The bread was dense and earthy, with a mineral sweetness from the volcanic steam, and it was not the same as oven bread, but it was bread, and it was cooked, and it was theirs. Next came the sun. Valith 9 orbited twin stars, a yellow primary and a smaller orange companion, and the daylight on the colony side of the planet was intense and long. An engineer named Priya Okafor designed the first solar concentrator from polished salvage metal, a massive parabolic dish that focused sunlight into a beam so precise it could heat a cooking surface to 300 degrees in minutes. They built 3 of them on the ridge above the colony, and the first thing Kale cooked on a solar-heated stone plate was a steak. Real synthetic protein, grown in the colony labs, but seasoned with dried herbs and salt, and pressed against stone that had been heated by nothing but starlight. The sear was beautiful, dark and caramelized, with those perfect crosshatch marks that meant the Maillard reaction was happening. Proteins and sugars transforming under heat into hundreds of new flavor compounds that did not exist in nature and could only be created by cooking. Kale ate that steak, standing in the sunlight with grease on his fingers, and he thought about his grandmother. And he thought about the human who had ever stood over a heat source and turned raw ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. The team grew bolder after that. They built steam chambers fed by geothermal pipes, where they could poach fish and vegetables in mineral-rich vapor. They designed friction engines that spun heavy stone wheels against each other until the friction generated enough heat to sear meat on contact. They experimented with focused acoustic energy that vibrated molecules fast enough to generate cooking temperatures. Every method was documented and tested and verified against the exact language of Edict 4491C. No combustion, no oxidation of fuel, no open flame, just heat from sources that had nothing to do with fire. The Concord inspectors came, of course. They always came. 3 Vren officials in their dark armor walked through the solar cooking station and examined every surface and scanned every device and found nothing. Instrument near the parabolic dish, while Priya focused a beam of sunlight onto a pot of water that was boiling furiously, and the instrument confirmed what they already knew. 0 combustion, 0 atmospheric contaminants, 0 violations. The inspector looked at the boiling water, and then looked at Priya and said, "This is sunlight." "Yes," Priya said with a smile that could have cut glass. "You are boiling water with sunlight." "The sun does not belong to the Concord," Priya said, and the inspector had no response to that. The first real meal came on a Sunday, because Kale insisted. It had always been Sunday dinners at his grandmother's house, and some things were sacred. They set up long tables in the open air, near the solar concentrators and the geothermal pits, and they cooked for 6 hours, and they fed every human in the colony. The menu was not fancy: solar roasted vegetables, and geothermal bread, and friction-seared protein, and steam-cooked rice, and a dessert of sun-caramelized fruit that Rena had invented by accident, when she left a tray of sliced mangoes under a focused solar beam for too long, and they turned into something like warm candy. People came, and they sat, and they ate, and some of them laughed, and some of them cried, and some of them just closed their eyes and chewed slowly, because the taste of cooked food after weeks of cold nutrient paste was like hearing music after a long silence. Kale watched from the kitchen line, and felt something warm in his chest that was not fire, but served the same purpose. What he did not notice at first was the figure watching from the tree line at the edge of the clearing, a Sulani, the amphibious species whose lobbying had helped create the ban in the first place. This one was young, with blue-green skin that shifted color in the light, and large, dark eyes that tracked the movement of steam rising from the bread pits with something that looked very much like fascination. His name was Orat, and he was a biochemist, and he had come to observe the humans out of scientific curiosity and nothing more, or at least that is what he told himself as he stood downwind of the cooking and breathed in the smell of roasted garlic and caramelized sugar and freshly baked bread. He should have been repulsed. His species found smoke and combustion byproducts physically painful. But there was no smoke here. There was only steam and heat and an aroma that his brain had no category for, but that his body responded to with a sudden and confusing hunger. Orat left before anyone saw him, but he came back the next day and the day after that, and each time he stood a little closer. Back on Hearthstone Station, High Arbiter Thesic sat in his office and reviewed the surveillance footage from the solar cooking site, and he watched humans laughing and eating and sharing food that steamed in the cool air of Valith 9, and he felt something he could not name, which irritated him greatly. He turned to his Gezur advisor, a crystalline figure named Sarath, who stood in the corner like a sculpture made of frozen light. "Is this legal?" Thesic asked. Sarath's crystal body flickered with colors that Thesic had learned to read over years of working together. And right now, those colors said something very close to frustration. "Technically," Sarath said, and the word hung in the air like steam. "Yes." Thesic turned back to the footage and watched a human child bite into a piece of solar-baked bread and smile with her whole face. And he thought that for a species that had just lost its fire, they looked remarkably undefeated. The word spread the way all dangerous things spread, slowly at first, and then all at once like a crack racing through ice. It started with the Torvan. Commandant Druk was a creature built for war, nearly 2.5 meters of dense muscle and thick gray skin covered in ritual scars that mapped every battle he had survived. His species ate raw meat, torn from the bone, and they were proud of it, the way a storm is proud of its thunder. They had never needed fire, and they had never wanted it. But Druk had a problem. He was bored with food. Every meal for 50 years had been the same: cold flesh and blood and mineral paste, functional and joyless. He ate to live, and he had forgotten that eating could be anything else. Then one of his soldiers came back from the human quarter with a piece of friction-seared meat wrapped in geothermal bread, and Druk smelled it before the soldier even entered the room, and something ancient in his brain sat up and paid attention. He took the food and examined it. The meat was dark on the outside, with a caramelized crust and pink and tender within. The bread was warm and chewy, and when he put them together and bit down, every nerve in his jaw sent a message to his brain that he had never received before. The message was this: food can be more than survival. Food can be joy. Druk chewed slowly, and then he swallowed. And then he looked at his soldier and said, "Take me to the human who made this." That was how Commandant Druk ended up standing in Kale's outdoor kitchen at sunrise. A massive alien warrior watching a human man cook breakfast with concentrated sunlight. And that was how the first non-human customer of the Crucible was born. Druk came back every day, and he brought soldiers with him. And those soldiers brought friends, and the word kept spreading. The Ilvari came next. They were a species of aesthetic philosophers, tall and slender beings, with skin like polished silver, and eyes that saw in spectrums humans could not imagine. They experienced taste as something close to music. Each flavor a note, each combination a chord, and their entire cuisine was built around flavored light pulses that they considered the highest form of art. When Ilvari cultural attaché named Ven first tasted Rena's geothermal curry, a dish of slow-cooked spices and vegetables steamed over volcanic vents for 8 hours, she stood completely still for almost a full minute. Her silver skin rippled with color that her companions later said represented an emotional state they had no word for in their language. When she finally spoke, she described the curry as a symphony performed inside a dying star, and she said it with tears running down her silver face. The Ilvari delegation formally requested that Kale prepare a banquet for their upcoming cultural summit. This was unprecedented. No Ilvari had ever allowed another species to contribute to one of their artistic events. Then the smaller species came. The Cathari, who were tiny insectoid beings that normally ate pollen paste, tried solar-toasted grain cakes and declared them superior to anything in their 3,000-year culinary history. The Morvan, who were aquatic creatures that lived in pressurized tanks, tried steam-poached fish and said it made them feel like they were swimming in flavor. Even a few Sulani came despite the scandal it caused within their own community. Orat was not the only one who had been watching from the edges. Young Sulani scientists and students, drawn by curiosity and the smell of bread, they came nervously with their sensitive skin covered in protective barriers, and they tasted cooked food for the first time, and most of them came back. Orat, by this time, had become a regular. He sat in the back of the outdoor kitchen every evening with a notebook, and he documented everything. Not just what the humans cooked, but how the cooking changed the food at a molecular level. He analyzed the proteins and the amino acids and the volatile compounds that formed when heat was applied to organic matter. And he discovered something remarkable. Cooking did not just make food taste different, it made food fundamentally better. Heat broke down complex proteins into forms that were easier to absorb. It unlocked nutrients that were inaccessible in raw food. It created entirely new molecular compounds that did not exist anywhere in nature. Compounds that fed the brain and the body in ways that raw consumption simply could not match. He published his findings in a paper titled Thermal Gastronomy, the uniquely human catalysis, and it went viral across every academic network in the Concord within hours. It was downloaded and cited and debated, and it made Orat both famous and hated in equal measure. The Sulani government formally disowned him. His family stopped taking his calls. But Orat kept coming to the kitchen. Kale watched all of this happen with a mix of pride and growing unease, because he knew that success this visible would attract attention from the wrong people. And he was right. The great banquet happened on a clear evening when both suns painted the sky in shades of gold and deep orange. 200 delegates from 40 different species gathered in a natural amphitheater that the humans had transformed into the most ambitious kitchen the galaxy had ever seen. Solar concentrators lined the ridgeline like sentinels, catching the last light of the day. Geothermal pits steamed beneath stone cooking surfaces. Friction engines hummed quietly, spinning heated stones into position. And the steam chambers vented fragrant clouds that drifted across the gathering like edible ghosts. Kale and his team had been cooking for 36 hours straight. Rena managed the solar stations with Priya, while Tomas ran the geothermal pits, and Marco baked bread after bread. After bread, because the demand never stopped. The menu was a love letter to human culinary history. solar roasted root vegetables glazed with reduced fruit syrup, geothermal steamed dumplings filled with spiced protein, friction-seared cuts of meat served on heated stone plates that kept the food warm, steam-poached fish with herbs from the colony greenhouse, sun-dried flatbreads with churned butter and volcanic salt, and for dessert, a caramelized fruit tart baked in a solar oven that Priya had calibrated so precisely it could brown the top without burning the custard. 200 aliens sat down and ate together, and the sounds they made were not translatable, but they did not need to be, because joy sounds the same in every language. Commandant Druck wept openly over his plate of braised ribs, and nobody dared say a word about it. Then the Ilvari composed a piece of sensory art on the spot that she called Taste of Starfire, and dedicated it to Kale, young Kithari. Delegates ate until their tiny bodies could hold no more, and then asked for containers to bring food home. It was the single greatest cultural event in the history of Valith 9. And it was also the beginning of the end. Because the Gezur had been watching. Serath, the Crystal Advisor, had monitored every moment of the banquet through surveillance feeds. And what she saw was not a dinner party, but an invasion. Humans were not just cooking, they were converting other species to their way of life. They were spreading their thermal obsession like a virus, and if it was not stopped, it would consume the cultural identity of every species it touched. The Gezur filed a formal grievance the next morning. They argued that humans were violating the spirit of Edict 4491C, even if they were technically obeying its letter. They demanded that the ban be expanded to cover all thermal food preparation, regardless of heat source. The Sulani government joined the grievance. Despite growing dissent within their own population, they could not afford to look weak, not when their own citizens were sneaking off to eat human bread. High Arbiter Thesic received the grievance and read it 3 times, and each time he felt the weight of it pressing down on his thorax like a stone. He had tasted that bread. He remembered the way it crumbled in his mandibles. He remembered the warmth of it and the strange feeling it had created inside him, a feeling he still could not name. But the law was the law, and the grievance was valid, and he had no choice. He issued a summons for Kale Mbangu to appear before an emergency tribunal to answer for humanity's thermal cooking practices and to argue why they should not be permanently banned. The summons arrived at the kitchen at dawn, and Kale read it standing in the first light of the twin suns, with flour on his hands and the smell of fresh bread in the air. He folded the summons and put it in his apron pocket and looked at Rena. "Get me a covered dish," he said. "I am bringing bread to court." The tribunal chamber was a cold and enormous room carved into the bedrock beneath Hearthstone Station, shaped like an inverted dome so that every sound fell downward and gathered at the center where the accused was meant to stand and feel the full crushing weight of Concord authority. Kale walked in carrying a covered dish and wearing his kitchen whites, because Rena had told him to wear something formal, and he had said that his chef's coat was the most formal thing he owned, and she had looked at him for a long moment, and then nodded, because she understood. The tribunal panel sat on a raised semicircular platform above him, High Arbiter Thesic in the center, with his dark green chitin gleaming under the chamber lights, flanked by 12 associate arbiters from 12 different species, some of whom Kale had cooked for, and some of whom had never tasted anything warmer than room temperature in their entire lives. The gallery was packed. Word had gotten out, because word always gets out, and hundreds of beings from dozens of species had crammed into the observation tiers to watch. Kale spotted Druk near the back, with his arms crossed, and his scarred face set in an expression that promised violence if things went badly. Then the Ilvari sat in the front row with her silver skin already shifting colors in anticipation. And somewhere in the middle rows, Orat sat alone with his protective barrier covering his Sulani skin and his notebook open on his knee. The Gezur spoke first. Their representative was Seroth herself, the crystal advisor who had watched the great banquet through surveillance feeds and seen a threat where others had seen a dinner. She moved to the center of the floor, and her crystalline body refracted the chamber lights into scattered rainbows that danced across the walls as she spoke. Humanity was given a clear boundary, Seroth said, and her voice was the sound of glass singing, beautiful and cutting at the same time. Edict 4491C was not merely a restriction on combustion. It was a declaration that thermal violence against organic matter has no place in civilized space. The humans have spent the months since this edict finding ways to continue their primitive heat obsession through alternative means. They have turned stones and steam and starlight into weapons of cultural contamination. She paused, and the rainbows on the walls went still. Other species are abandoning their own food traditions to consume human thermal products. This is not cultural exchange. This is cultural erasure. If it is not stopped, the entire nutritional identity of Concord space will be consumed by humanity's addiction to heat. The Sulani representative spoke next, a senior diplomat named Tessara, who looked uncomfortable the entire time, as if she knew her argument was thin, but had been ordered to make it anyway. The atmospheric modeling is clear, Tessara said. Widespread adoption of thermal food processes across multiple species will generate cumulative heat output and vapor emissions that could destabilize the atmospheric balance of Valith 9 over the next 3 centuries. The risk is small, but it is real, and it is unnecessary when perfectly adequate cold nutrition exists. 3 centuries, Kale thought. They are arguing about whether 300 years from now to justify taking our food away today. Then it was his turn. Kale walked to the center of the floor and set his covered dish on the small table that had been placed there for evidence. The cover clinked against the plate, and the sound echoed up through the inverted dome and fell back down around him like rain. He did not bring notes, he did not bring legal arguments, he did not bring charts or data or atmospheric models. He brought a story. About 1 million years ago, Kale said, and his voice was quiet, but the chamber's design carried it to every ear and audio receptor in the room. Creature that was not quite human, yet sat in a place that was not quite home, and found a piece of meat near a place where lightning had set the ground on fire. This creature was hungry. It was always hungry, and the meat smelled different than raw meat. It smelled warm and rich, and something in the creature's brain said, "Try it." So it did, and everything changed. Kale looked up at the tribunal panel and made sure he met Thessic's compound eyes before he continued. That was not just the beginning of cooking. That was the beginning of us. The heat broke down the proteins and the fibers, and it unlocked calories and nutrients that our ancestors could not get from raw food. Those extra calories fed our growing brains. Our brains grew larger, we developed language and tools and art and community. And at the center of every single one of those developments was a fire with food cooking over it. Every human civilization in history was built around it. Kitchen. Not a throne room, not a temple, not a weapons forge. A kitchen. The place where we gather and share and feed each other. The Romans built their empire, but they are remembered for their bread. The Chinese invented gunpowder, but they are celebrated for their cooking. My own ancestors crossed oceans and survived horrors that I cannot describe in this chamber, but they carried their recipes with them because the recipes were more important than anything else they owned. Kale paused and let the silence work, because silence was an ingredient too. You are not banning a process, he said. You are banning a language. Every dish is a sentence. Every recipe is a story passed from parent to child across 1,000 generations. You are asking us to go mute. The chamber was very quiet. We did not fight your edict, Kale continued. We did not protest or riot or threaten. We adapted. We found heat in the rocks beneath our feet and the stars above our heads. Turning of stone against stone. We did this, not because we are stubborn, although we are. We did this because cooking is not a luxury for us. It is how we love each other. He reached for the covered dish and lifted the lid. Steam rose from a round loaf of solar-baked bread sitting on the plate beside a small pot of steam-churned butter and a handful of geothermal roasted garlic cloves. The smell hit the chamber like a wave, and Kale watched it move through the room, watched nostrils flare, and sensory organs twitch, and crystalline bodies shift their light frequencies. "I brought this for you," Kale said to the tribunal, "not as evidence, not as argument, but as an invitation. Taste what you are trying to destroy before you destroy it." The chamber erupted in murmurs, and Fesic raised two of his forearms for silence, and got it eventually. Protocol said the tribunal should not accept offerings from the accused. Protocol said evidence must be submitted through formal channels and examined by neutral parties. Protocol said 100 things that did not account for the smell of fresh bread, filling a room full of beings who had never known they were hungry until that exact moment. Fesic looked at the bread, and then looked at Kale, and then he reached down with one long segmented arm, and tore off a piece and put it in his mandibles. He chewed slowly, and the chamber held its breath. Then other arbiters reached forward, and they tore off pieces too, and they tasted it, and the room filled with small sounds that needed no translation. The doors at the back of the gallery burst open, and Orat came running down the aisle, which was a violation of about 15 different tribunal protocols, but nobody stopped him, because he was waving his notebook and shouting. "I have new data," Orat said breathlessly. "Thermal food processing generates complex amino acid chains and bioavailable micronutrient compounds that no other preparation method in the known galaxy can produce. I have tested this across 11 species, and the results are consistent. Cooked food is not just different from raw food, it is nutritionally superior in measurable ways." He reached the floor of the chamber and held up his notebook like it was a holy text. Banning human cooking is not a cultural restriction, it is nutritional suppression. You would be denying every species in this concord access to a form of nourishment that their biology can benefit from. This is not protection, this is deprivation. The murmurs became a roar. Then Commandant Druch stood up in the gallery, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade through flesh. "I have eaten their food," Druch said, and every being in the room turned to look at him, because when a Torvan warrior speaks, you listen or you regret it. "I will not return to rawness." He moved forward, and behind him rose delegates from 14 different species, Ilvariand, Kethari, and Morvan, and others, all standing together in a display that the Concord had never seen before. "If you ban their kitchens," Druch said with absolute finality, "you ban mine." Seraph's crystal body dimmed visibly, and Tessara the Sulani diplomat put her head in her hands, and Fesic looked out over his tribunal chamber, and saw something that frightened him more than fire ever could. He saw unity, not human unity, but galactic unity, built not on treaties or trade agreements or military alliances, but on the simple shared experience of eating a good meal together. Fesic adjourned the tribunal without a verdict, and the chamber emptied slowly, and the noise faded, and eventually only Fesic remained, sitting alone in the great inverted dome. He looked down at the table where Kale's dish still sat, with crumbs of bread scattered around it, and a few roasted garlic cloves remaining. He reached down and took the last piece of bread, and spread butter on it, and placed a garlic clove on top, and ate it alone in the silence of the empty chamber. And as he chewed, he finally found the word for the feeling that human food created inside him. The word was belonging. The tribunal reconvened on a morning when the twin suns of Valith 9 rose in perfect alignment, and cast a single golden beam through the high windows of the chamber, and landed directly on the empty table, where a loaf of bread had once changed history. Kale stood in the same spot, wearing the same kitchen whites, now with a new flour stain on the sleeve, from the batch of bread he had baked at 4 in the morning, because he could not sleep. Rena stood behind him in the gallery, and Drook sat with his arms crossed, and Arat sat with his notebook closed, because everything that needed to be written had been written. Thesic entered and took his seat, and the chamber fell silent, in the way that rooms fall silent when everyone knows something important is about to happen. The High Arbiter looked older than he had a few months ago. His chitin had dulled slightly, and his compound eyes moved more slowly across the room. But his voice, when he spoke, was clear. Weight of someone who had spent many sleepless nights arriving at a decision. The Concord exists to protect the rights and identities of all species within its jurisdiction, Thesic began. Edict 4491C was created to address legitimate concerns about atmospheric contamination and cultural sensitivity. Those concerns remain valid. Kale felt his stomach tighten. However, Thesic continued, and that single word opened a door that the entire chamber leaned toward. This tribunal has heard testimony and reviewed evidence that compels us to distinguish between combustion and thermal food preparation. They are not the same process, they do not carry the same risks, and they do not deserve the same prohibition. He paused and looked directly at Kale. Edict 4491C remains in full effect. Open combustion is still banned on Valith 9 and all shared Concord territories. But this tribunal hereby rules that thermal food preparation through non-combustion means, including solar concentration, geothermal energy, mechanical friction, steam processes, and other methods that generate heat without oxidation of fuel, is formally recognized as a protected cultural practice under Concord law. The chamber erupted, but Thesic was not finished. A new legal category is hereby established, he said, raising his voice above the noise. Heritage catalysis, defined as the application of heat to organic matter for the purpose of nutritional and cultural transformation through non-combustion means. This category is protected under Article 7 of the Concord Cultural Preservation Charter, and may not be restricted without unanimous consent of all member species. Unanimous consent, Kale thought. That meant every single one of the 312 species would have to agree to ban it. It was as close to permanent protection as anything could get in Concord law. The Gezur delegation stood and walked out of the chamber. Crystal body was dark, almost opaque, radiating a cold that everyone near her could feel. But she said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The vote had been taken, and the Gezur had lost. Tisara, the Sulani diplomat, stayed in her seat and looked at Orat across the chamber. And something passed between them that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Kale stood very still in the center of the floor and let the noise wash over him, and then Rena was beside him, with her hand on his shoulder. And she said, "We did it, Chef." And he said, "No, we just got permission to keep doing what we never stopped doing." What happened next happened fast in the way that revolutions happen fast once the dam breaks. Kale opened the Crucible as a permanent establishment in a natural stone amphitheater near the geothermal vents, the first interspecies restaurant in Concord history. It had solar grills along the ridgeline that caught the twin suns from dawn to dusk. Geothermal bread ovens built directly over the volcanic vents, steam chambers for poaching and slow cooking, friction-heated stone plates for searing, and a device that Priya built in her spare time that she called the Starforge, a microwave plasma searing station that technically created temperatures hotter than any fire on Earth, but involved zero combustion. The Starforge could put a perfect crust on a piece of protein in 3 seconds flat, and it made a sound like a tiny thunderclap every time it fired, and Priya loved it more than she loved most people. Orat became the first non-human to formally apprentice under a human chef. He studied under Kale for 2 years and learned everything from bread baking to sauce making, and he discovered that Sulani biology was particularly well suited to detecting subtle flavor compounds that humans could not taste. He became a bridge between species, translating human cooking techniques into methods that alien biologies could appreciate. Druck took what he learned at the Crucible back to the Torvan Quarter and started a geothermal smoking tradition that transformed Torvan cuisine overnight. Huge cuts of meat hung in underground chambers, where volcanic steam and mineral vapors infused them over days. The Torvan called it deep fire cooking, even though there was no fire involved. And when Kale pointed this out, Druck just grinned with all of his many teeth and said that the name was not about the flame, but about the feeling. The Ilvari went further than anyone expected. Ven collaborated with Kale and Priya to develop a cooking method that used focused acoustic vibration to heat food. Sound waves tuned to specific frequencies that agitated molecules until they reached cooking temperature. The Ilvari called it singing the meal, and they created dishes that were literally cooked by music, each frequency producing different heat patterns and therefore different flavors. Tasted like nothing else in the galaxy. A movement began to spread across Concord space. Journalists and academics and curious travelers came to Valith 9 to see the human kitchens, and they went home and told stories about what they had tasted. Within 5 years, non-combustion cooking had spread to 40 Concord worlds. Within 10 years, it was on 200. They called it the thermal renaissance. Species that had eaten nutrient paste for millennia were suddenly experimenting with geothermal baking. Races that had consumed raw food since before humans existed were building solar ovens and discovering the transformative power of heat. The Cathari developed a technique for toasting grain in concentrated starlight that produced flavors so complex that human food scientists spent years trying to understand them. Food became the thing that connected the galaxy in ways that politics and trade and even war never had, not because it was practical, but because it was personal. Because sitting down to eat a meal that someone had cooked for you was an act of care that transcended language and biology and the vast cold distances between stars. Earth received a formal invitation to host the first Galactic Culinary Congress. 700 species would attend. It would be the largest cultural gathering in Concord history. And for the first time ever, a species was being honored, not for its military strength, or its technological innovation, or its diplomatic skill, but for its kitchen. The day the invitation arrived, Kale read it in his restaurant, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a dinner service in full swing. Torvan cooks working the geothermal pits alongside Ilvari acoustic chefs and Sulani flavor specialists, and human line cooks shouting orders in a dozen languages. And he thought about his grandmother, who had never left Earth, and who had never met an alien, and who had taught him that feeding people was the most important thing a person could do. He thought she would have liked this. Years passed, and Kale got older. His hands bore scars from steam burns, and his skin was weathered from years of standing under focused sunlight. His hair went gray and then white, and he moved more slowly between his stations, but he never stopped cooking. The Galactic Culinary Congress was built as a permanent orbiting station around a young bright star, a massive structure shaped like a ring, with kitchens and dining halls and teaching spaces, where thousands of species could come to learn and cook and eat together. They named it the Hearth, and it was the most visited place in Concord space within a year of its opening. Kale stood in the central kitchen on the day it opened, the largest kitchen ever built, with solar collectors that focused the station's host star into precise cooking beams, and geothermal simulators and acoustic heating chambers and friction engines and a dozen other methods of generating heat that humans and aliens had invented together in the years since a stubborn chef had refused to stop cooking. The air was thick with alien spices and familiar aromas, steam rising from 100 stations where 100 species prepared food, side by side, and Kale watched it all and felt the warmth of it settle into his old bones. Rena stood beside him, gray-haired herself now, but still sharp, still the fastest hands on a prep line that Kale had ever seen. She watched a beam of concentrated starlight sear a perfect crust onto a loaf of bread on the station nearest to them, and the smell of it filled the air, and she turned to Kale and asked the question, "Do you ever miss fire?" Kale watched the starlight do its work, watched the bread turn golden under the focused power of an actual star, watched a young Torvan apprentice pull the loaf from the solar plate and break it open and offer a piece to a Sulani colleague who took it without hesitation. Smiled. He thought about his grandmother's kitchen with its old gas stove and its tin roof and the way the flames had danced under her pots. He thought about the lighter that still sat in a drawer in his quarters, untouched since the night the kitchen died. He thought about all the fire that humanity had ever burned, and all the kitchens that had ever been built. And he smiled. Fire was just the beginning, Kale said. They tried to take our flame and we cooked with the sun instead. That is the thing about humans, Rena. You cannot starve a species that learned to make the whole universe into a kitchen. Rena laughed, and the sound mixed with the clatter of pans, and the hiss of steam, and the hum of solar collectors, and the distant singing of Ilvari acoustic ovens, and it became part of the music that filled the greatest kitchen the galaxy had ever known. And somewhere in that kitchen a piece of bread was always baking, and a meal was always being shared, and the warmth that had started with a creature putting meat near heat 1,000,000 years ago continued to spread outward from every human hand that reached for a plate and said without words the oldest and most important thing that humans had ever learned to say: "Sit down, eat, you are welcome here."